Folks, welcome back to your favorite Magnus Carlsen recap channel. Today's an extra special episode because we're playing against Hikaru Nakamura. So this is probably the most anticipated match of the year. I'm excited to share it with you. It starts out with knight to f3, d5, g3. It's the ready opening. And after g6, bishop to g2, bishop to g7, d4, knight to f6. We have a symmetrical position, both players castle. And now c4, striking forward at the center here, and there's already a bit of tension on move 5. And if you're Hikaru here, what do? Do you play c6 defending the pawn? You take the pawn, maybe even c5, striking forward at the center yourself? But Hikaru decides to take the pawn here. And after knight to a3, Magnus is going to get it back, because you can't defend it with this pawn, and if you defend it with the bishop, then knight to g5, and you're attacking the bishop. And you can't hold on to it, so c5. And now the center is about to be broken wide open. But after knight captures c4, Magnus does have a little bit more of an active knight here. So bishop e6, and now Hikaru is targeting that knight and activating his bishop. However, blocking off the e7 pawn here. And after knight f to e5, Magnus is now defending the knight here and opens up the bishop on the diagonal. Currently threatening the rook, could take the pawn and then take the rook, so Hikaru has to deal with that. And maybe the best move here is queen to c8. And that defends the pawn, lines the queen up with the bishop, puts the queen on the almost open file here, and just a slightly better position. But instead, he goes for bishop to d5. And this targets the g2 bishop here, which is probably Magnus's most powerful piece. So not a bad idea here. But after d captures c5, now Magnus is up a pawn, but Hikaru feels like he's going to get it back. So he takes the bishop, and before taking back, he decides to trade queens. And after king captures g2, Hikaru is down a pawn, but he's planning on winning it back. So he plays knight to e4, attacking the pawn, activating the bishop a little bit, and here Magnus goes for bishop to e3, adding a defender to the pawn, activating the bishop, also connecting the rooks, and after knight to a6 from Hikaru, adding an attacker to the pawn here, Magnus says b4, defending the pawn, but also just offering up this pawn to Hikaru, and that gives the pawn back, evens up the material, but it opens up this file for the rook, and the rook can slide over to b1, and that's a much more active rook, trading a pawn for an active rook. And a rook is much more powerful than a pawn if you can use it right. So Hikaru thinks for a little bit, and then he decides to take the pawn, giving Magnus the open file with the rook after rook a to b1, and now the knight's not defended, so a5 defends the knight, and now a3 attacks the knight. Well, the knight should go to probably c2 here, according to the engine, because after knight to c6, apparently we have a big mistake, and this is where it starts to go in Magnus's favor. And if Magnus finds the right moves, he should be able to win here. And this knight is under attack twice, so you have to deal with that. So he decides to trade knights, and after the pawn takes the knight, now, what do? Well, now you can bring the rook up to b6 to attack the pawn. You can go to b7 to be on the 7th rank and attack this pawn. And the best move apparently is to play rook to d1, and then get this rook trade, and then bring your rook up to the 7th rank. Or you could just bring your rook up to the 7th rank right now. Or you can play the third best move according to the engine, which Magnus played, which is rook to b6, which attacks this pawn, but is apparently less winning, because apparently it's much better to have your rook on the 7th rank, and then you're going to win these pawns anyway. But instead we have rook to b6, and then bishop to d4, defended by the rook here, blocking the defense of the pawn by the bishop, and attacking the bishop. But now rook captures c6, bishop captures e3, the knight takes, and Magnus is currently up a pawn, and the pawn that he's up is a passed pawn, and with the threat of promoting to a queen, there's a definite advantage for Magnus here. And with perfect play, he could promote and win the game. So rook a to c8, getting in front of the pawn here. And if Hikaru can trade down into an endgame, the one pawn might not be enough, but it is. And after rook captures c8, rook captures c8, we're attacking the pawn twice. And after rook to c1, now the pawn's gone, and we trade rooks. And after knight to c4, now even material, and it looks like it could be a draw, but Magnus's king is slightly closer to the middle, and it's going to get over here a little bit faster than Hikaru can. And that's going to make all the difference, because that means Magnus has a chance of winning, and Hikaru has to defend and stop the promotion. But it might be too late. a4, stopping the pawn from moving forward, and it's defended by the knight here. And now king to f3, starting to move the king over. The king has to come over if you want to take this pawn. And now Hikaru plays f6, and he's getting ready to bring the king out, but he's moving the pawns down first. King e3, continuing to bring the king over, e5, knight to d6, and now this stops the king from coming to f7, and also now Magnus can play knight to e4, and this will offer a knight trade, and after they trade knights, it'll still be even material. This will be a winning king and pawn endgame for Magnus. Magnus will just walk over, take the pawn, and then promote it, and Hikaru will not be able to stop it. And if he tries to stop it, then Magnus will just bring his king over here, take these pawns, and then promote over here. So it's looking like a winning game for Magnus so far. But f5, knight to c4, attacking the pawn here, knight to d7, defending the pawn, king to d2, bringing the king over a little bit more, king f7, starting to bring the king to the middle, king c3, king e6, king b4, now attacking the pawn, but king to d5, attacking the knight, and if you take the pawn, then you take the knight. And now Hikaru's king is in the middle. And knight to e3, check. And after king to d4, now Magnus is about to take this pawn, but then king to c3, and if you go king to b5, then Hikaru has king to d2. And this knight can stop the promotion, and this king's going to gobble all these pawns up, and it's a draw. So you can't take the pawn yet. So knight to c2, check. And Magnus is low on time, but after king to d5, he can just repeat moves and buy himself some time. Or he could just take the pawn now. And this looks like it's going to be a winning game. But low on time, he plays king to b5, probably thinking he can just take this pawn at any time, and he just wants to wait a little bit more and think, with less than 10 seconds on the clock. But now Hikaru has chances, and he can start the pawn storm, but first he plays knight to c5, defending the pawn. And now after knight to b4 check, there's king to d6. You have to go to king to d6, because if you go king to d4, then e3 check, king to c3, and then you lose your knight. So king has to go back here, and now after f3, the game is completely drawn, because now the pawns can storm down the board, and the knight has access to the pawns. So king to c4, g5, and knight to d5, and Magnus has to reroute his knight in order to attack this pawn. But now Hikaru plays knight to b3, and the knight is coming in. Knight to c3, attacking the pawn now, but knight to d2 check. And after the king goes to d3, the knight goes to f1, attacking the pawn. Now knight captures a4, finally getting rid of the pawn that's blocking the pawn from going down the board, but knight captures h2, and now you're losing all your pawns, and Hikaru can almost get a promotion now. But king to e3, g4, king f2, g captures f3, e captures f3, e4, f captures e4, f captures e4, knight to c3, attacking the pawn, knight to g4 check, king e2, king e5, a4, knight h6, a5, king d6, knight captures e4 check, king c5, knight to d2, king b5, knight to b3, knight f5, king f3, knight e7, king f4, knight c6, king g5, king b4, knight d2, king captures a5, king captures h5, knight e5, king g4, king b5, king f5, knight f7, knight f3, king c5, knight e5, knight to d6 check, king e6, knight e4, g4, king to d4, knight f7, king e3, king f5, knight to g3 check, king e5, knight to e4, king f5, knight to g3 check, king e6, knight to e4, king e5, knight to d2, knight to g5, knight to c4 check, king to f5, king to d3, king f4, knight to e3, knight to e4, knight captures g4, and with no pawns, the game is a draw. And that's just the first game of Magnus versus Hikaru. If you want to see more of this epic professional chess gameplay, hit that like button so I know. Thanks for watching today's episode of the Bobby Bo Show. Hope you have an excellent rest of your day.